So the second part, or 8.2 of this chapter, they talk about how we have these domesticated plants and animals, but there are different ones in different world locations. And we just saw how there are some that are available in different places and some that really aren't available in other places and did not lead to the adoption of agriculture. And so in some of these areas, there is this a transition to a reliance on domesticated plants and animals as your main food sources. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the exact cause for why people started to really intensify their agricultural production. On the one hand, we have climate change, in this case, the warming that happened, and that's an important part of this. But why would people give up successful hunting and gathering practices? Some people have suggested that it's you needed to feed more people, population pressure. Yeah, it certainly could have an effect, but it doesn't seem, when we think about these transitions and those early phases of domestication, it doesn't seem like there was a population effect that made people depend on these things. And so what we see here, as we saw in that big world map, is each particular place had its own specific plants, its animals, its ecosystem, and different timing on how people settled and used these things. So sometimes people try to make this into one huge overarching idea or theory about human development, but we actually see as different forms of horticulture or small scale plantings and agriculture in different parts of the world. And so it's important to keep our eye on that because these big motor theories don't seem to be, at least at this point, supported by the evidence that we have archaeologically. And so when it comes to sedentary agriculture, people settling down and farming, what we see is not this instant transition, but a long process in which people stay mobile sometimes, then they settle, go back to being mobile. It changes in different parts of the world and in different areas. And in most areas, it's a process that happens over several thousand years. And people continue to have a diet which includes hunting and gathering. They continue to rely on what we might call wild plants and animals or include that in part of their life. And some people have domesticated and switched into more agricultural practices and then over time decided they didn't like that so much and want to go into hunting and gathering. So this is not necessarily just something that you need to do, but there is a effect over time which happens when the population begins to grow after agriculture happens. So what's interesting is that with agriculture, what it makes possible is that you have these cereal crops, rice, wheat, that are more digestible. And so for kids, for babies, it makes it possible to wean your children earlier or take them off of breastfeeding. And so if you're doing less breastfeeding, then for those of you who know about these things, then your ovulation happens again and you can have children more often. So in most hunter-gatherer groups, because they are more mobile, because their foods are less amenable to being easily digested, the breastfeeding will last longer and the women too are more mobile, and so there'll be a natural spacing of children every 5 to 7 years. Whereas in agricultural societies, you can start having a kid every 1 or 2 years because you can do that. Why would we want to have all these kids? Yeah, you make it sound so nice, but yeah, if you're the child working on the farm, it might not be so nice. But yes, there's more need for labor. They talk about the lock-in effect. This creates a feedback loop where you need more labor to work on the farm, and so you want more children, and you increase the population. And then once you're in this mutual dependency, it's harder to get out. One of the interesting things about this, perhaps surprising, are the health consequences that come to us, at least in certain areas, from
some of this early agriculture. Yeah, this is counterintuitive. How would you have more food and malnutrition at the same time? So if you look archaeologically at some of these early farmers, not all, but in certain areas, they're often shorter in stature and less well nourished than their hunter-gatherer counterparts. And yes, some of that becomes from the fact that in order to farm the land, you actually have to increase your labor. It's a stereotype that hunter-gatherers have to work all the time. In most hunter-gatherer societies, you can get your basic needs with more like 15 to 20 hours of work a week, whereas working on a farm involves a lot of work. There's a decrease in dietary diversity. So we go from having a number of different plants and animals to becoming dependent on one main crop. Maybe it's rice, maybe it's wheat, maybe it's corn, maybe it's potatoes. And you increase, because those are more abundant, you increase your carb intake. And yes, leading to more cavities, dental tooth decay. Hunter-gatherers have some of the best teeth in the world because their food is so gritty and not easily digestible. So it's like you're brushing your teeth as you eat. But if you can combine these things, especially when they become combined with various sugars and sweeteners, that's where we get to some of our issues today. Also, disease. We talked about how diseases spread more in groups, social groups, but it's even more pronounced if you have domesticated animals. Many of our plagues and poxes and various things that have swept through and killed many people come from our close association with domestic animals. We even have names for them that are associated with the animals we think they came from, chicken pox. And having these denser settlements, having these cities, increases the spread of these diseases. It's not that they're missing from hunters and gatherers, it's just that they don't spread as much. Also, we talked about malaria and adaptations to malaria, a few in the biological anthropology unit. Well, one of the reasons that happens is because people clear land for agriculture, irrigation, and that leads to an increase in mosquitoes and malaria. So again, we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these things. There's in different parts of the world and in different populations, certain people might benefit from this, but certain people might lose out in some way. So it's just important to keep in mind. In today's world, you may have heard that many people are trying to do a paleo diet or a Paleolithic diet because they feel like the agricultural diet is not so good for you. I wouldn't maybe go so far, but it is something that happens. Another thing that happens, in your book shows you a picture of potato farmers here in Bolivia. But when you become dependent on one crop, what we call monocropping, it can be risky if that crop fails. Now, your textbook gives you the example of the Irish potato famine, which is an interesting case because, for one thing, there were no potatoes in Ireland before Columbus and the Americas, and they were imported from South America into Ireland, but they became very much dependent on the potatoes, as did people in many parts of Europe. But if you develop one crop and you depend on it and you're only planting that crop, it can be risky if that crop fails. Now, this picture that they give you of the people in Bolivia is a little bit misleading because in the Andes, where the potato was domesticated, there are actually hundreds of varieties of potatoes. And so they don't have as much problem because they're able to plant different varieties of the potato and have different characteristics and names. But our contemporary monocropping, where we put, the same thing with corn, there's lots of varieties of maize or corn in Central and Mexico. But in our own world, we have one variety of corn, which we've proliferated out, and that leads to dependence and crop risk over time. So there's pluses and minuses to agriculture. There's different things that develop, and it's like everything in human evolution, there's trade-offs and risks and advantages and disadvantages in anything that happens.